An awesome race at the Red Bull Ring with strategy and on-track overtakes in a Grand Prix that showed how these regulations are working. All the while, Ferrari finally found a way to make a strategy work and spoil the Verstappen party. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Austrian Grand Prix. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. Ferrari strategy works, but the engine did not. Ferrari have finally managed to get a strategy right in Austria as they took advantage of the fact that they had the faster race car around the Red Bull Ring. It started with the Red Bull going for the early stop with Verstappen, committing the Dutch driver to the 2-stop strategy after Leclerc had got by in the first stint. Meanwhile, Ferrari kept both drivers out there and opted to not even cover the Red Bulls by taking advantage of the fact that they had 2 cars in the fight versus the single car for Red Bull. And it seemed like once the Ferraris stopped later in the race, they fell back behind Verstappen by almost 10 seconds, and looked like they had a choice of the 1 or the 2-stop strategy. But their pace advantage was unbelievable on the fresh tyres, and Leclerc made the moves on Verstappen look easy as he managed to overtake the world champion pretty soon after stopping. And then, the same thing happened again, with the Ferrari team seemingly having Red Bull in their back pockets this afternoon as they stopped late again and could have easily earned a 1-2 finish in the end if it wasn't for the engine fire that hit Sainz late on. It was an interesting decision from Ferrari from a strategy perspective as a radio message revealed that the Ferrari team were informing Carlos Sainz that they were going for Plan E, which doesn't exactly make it sound like they were particularly confident in their strategy decision. But clearly that was the way to go as they managed to get the win with Leclerc and should have had second with Sainz. The reliability problem for Sainz was a real shame, and it looked like a pretty catastrophic failure for the Spaniard. Similarly, the throttle issue for Leclerc right at the end of the race was a real concern, and you could see from the TV graphics that he wasn't ever fully off the throttle, which clearly made it even more difficult at the end. It's something that the team will need to look at, and so on the whole for Ferrari it's an amber box. They finally got the strategy right, and for that they deserve a green box, but the Sainz issue and the throttle problem for Leclerc means that it's an amber box in the end for me. They've got 2 wins in a row, so perhaps it's a sign of a rebound for the team this year. 3 podiums in a row for Lewis Hamilton. It was another podium finish for Lewis Hamilton and somehow a 3rd and 4th finish for Mercedes, which means they've scored the most points of any team from the Grand Prix itself, albeit not the whole weekend because of the sprint. Given the team's double crash on Friday evening, to come back and score so many points on the Sunday shows how well the team did to repair the cars as best they can, despite not having all the parts available to them. It's a brilliant result for the team, and given the reliability concerns for both of the teams ahead of them in the standings, I believe a win is well and truly in contention for Mercedes this year. Even when times are tough, they're still getting podiums and solid point hauls this weekend. George Russell's 4th place almost seemed to come out of nowhere as he dropped back with the 5-second penalty early on for hitting Perez off into the gravel at turn 4, but it was a brilliant recovery drive for him and Lewis Hamilton, and at the halfway point of the season, the team are right on track. So for me, it's a green box for Mercedes this weekend and Hamilton's 3rd podium finish in a row, and the battle between those 2 Mercedes drivers is certainly heating up. Before we take a look at inconsistencies from the FIA, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm so close to 50,000 subscribers, which I'm aiming to get to by the summer break, so if you haven't helped out already, then please help me get there. Thanks. FIA Inconsistencies. It feels like this weekend has exposed FIA inconsistencies that have been at the Red Bull Ring this weekend. For starters, coming into the season, the new race directors made it very clear that the racetrack would be determined by the white lines. It was a refreshing call as there have been so many issues with this in 2021. In Austria, it was clear that this could be a challenge, and as such, the FIA installed a fixed camera looking at the last corner. For me, I believe this was a good decision, and as a result, they were swift in deleting lap times whenever the car exceeded track limits at this turn. I even complimented these decisions on Twitter. But it then went wrong. Sergio Perez failed to put in a representative lap time through the majority of the Q2 session, and actually found himself needing to deliver on his final run to get himself into the top 10. He did so, but not without exceeding track limits at turn 8, a corner where the track limits weren't being closely monitored. It was identified just before Q3, and the stewards blamed the fact that they had too many incidents to check before they noticed, which meant his time wasn't deleted and he still made it through to Q3. In the end, after the session, his lap time and all subsequent Q3 lap times were deleted, but that didn't help Pierre Gasly, who started 11th and never even got the opportunity to challenge in Q3. and he could have been in at least 9th considering Hamilton failed to set a representative lap time in that session after his accident. And it was a weekend then to forget in the end for Pierre Gasly, as he had a turn 1 incident in the sprint race and was then penalised for track limit infringements and a crash with Vettel in the Grand Prix. So it was a shame that Perez's lap wasn't penalised in time to give Gasly a better chance this weekend. And likewise, after last weekend where the stewards were very lenient with the decisions at Silverstone, it was a shame to see Alex Albon receiving a 5-second penalty in the sprint for what seemed like a similar type of move to what we saw from Sergio Perez a week ago. It was the kind of inconsistency that was disappointing to see, and it's debatable over whether it was penalised due to the sausage curb on the outside, but I'll talk about that in more detail in a video coming later this week. There were other incidents where I think the stewards did a better job. The 5-second penalty for George Russell was certainly consistent with previous years for his incident with Perez into turn 4 on lap 1, just as Lewis Hamilton received a couple of years ago for his contact with Alex Albon. It's good to see the stewards making the same decisions that we've seen previously, and then the same decision was obviously made with Gasly and Vettel later in the race. In the race itself, it was almost laughable how many laps were deleted and how many penalties were dished out for track limit infringements. It is a difficult one to judge, as it's good that there was at least consistency, but perhaps it showed that the reduced visibility with the wheel wings this year means it's harder for drivers to know themselves where they are on the circuit. For me, I think it's important to be consistent, and if the white line is the way to do it, then so be it. But on the whole, this weekend there were inconsistencies from the FIA, compared to just last week at Silverstone, and as a result, I think the FIA are deserving of an amber box. It's not an easy job for them, and they did get some calls right, but there were also some clear errors, such as the Perez one in qualifying that was disappointing to see. Now, I'd actually written this section before the Carlos Sainz incident towards the end of the race, and at that time I thought the amber box was the right decision, but I'm actually going to change that to a red box. The FIA opted to go for a VSC rather than a full safety car, as they rescued the Ferrari car that was stranded in turn 4. But, as far as I'm aware, there was a tractor on the circuit to pick up the Ferrari, and therefore it must be a full safety car. The sport needs to learn from lessons of the past, and I don't think that a VSC is enough for those kinds of situations. Perhaps I'm being too cautious, but it just takes a brake failure into turn 4, even at VSC speeds, that could make those incidents even more serious. So it's now a red box for the FIA, in my opinion. Haas have another excellent weekend. It's been 2 weeks in a row now where the Haas cars have both finished in point scoring positions, and it seems like the Haas team are finding ways to continue to improve this car, or at least extract the absolute maximum from it, despite not bringing many new developments in 2022. It was great to see both Schumacher and Magnussen delivering in that car, and it looks more like the first few races in 2022 where they were right in the mix with Mercedes in the battle for the best of the rest. And now, for 2 weeks in a row, the superior speed from the Ferrari power unit has come good for Haas, and they've clearly worked out how best to set up their 2022 to get both drivers comfortable with it. All in all, it was a strong weekend, with the team getting both cars into Q3, 2 top 10 finishes in the sprint, and then 6th and 8th in the Grand Prix. It was a brilliant weekend and a huge haul of 14 points for the team, which means they've actually managed to get past AlphaTauri for 7th in the standings. The team have the momentum as they progress into the summer break, and it's Mick Schumacher that seems to be the driver that's starting to find his form, as once he scored his first F1 points last weekend at the British Grand Prix, he's now clearly on a high, as he's performing so well. It's a huge contrast to where he was at the beginning of the 2022 season, where he was struggling to match the performances of Kevin Magnussen. Now he's had the time to get comfortable with his new car and learn from a more experienced teammate, he's starting to realise the potential from the junior categories. So for me, it has to be a green box for Haas this weekend after a brilliant performance. We'll have to see if they can match that the next time out in France. The Red Bull Ring is one of the best. I have to say, this race is one that is on my list of races I'd love to go to. I even had tickets in 2020 before spectators weren't allowed to attend. And this year in particular, with the new regulations meaning the cars can race closer together, I have to say it was awesome to watch. During the race, there were different strategies, with the 1-stop and the 2-stop being relatively close to each other when it comes to overall race time. This meant that a race strategy was on, and there were so many cars on different tyre ages throughout the midfield, and given it's a circuit where overtaking is possible, it made for some awesome racing. Around lap 24 or so, there were 5 cars battling it out, with Ocon, Magnussen, Norris, Schumacher and Zhou all in the same place at the same time as the cars on fresh tyres were trying to carve their way through the field, and get past the drivers nursing their tyres so they could make a one-stop more realistic. And it was a battle that saw some clean but hard racing, which is exactly what we want to watch in Formula 1. And we saw these battles up and down the grid this afternoon, but admittedly DRS was still necessary to make overtaking possible. There was some awesome strategy and racing from so many of the teams and drivers, and the late VSC certainly added to that. It's a circuit that is one of the best and always seems to offer great races, and there were even drivers with penalties that still managed to get themselves back into the points. And to be honest, the order wasn't settled right until the end. So for me, this circuit is clearly getting a green box. Honourable Mentions. Not too many honourable mentions today, but I think Fernando Alonso's bad luck needs to be acknowledged this weekend. To have gone from 19th on the grid to 10th at the finish after all the issues he's faced this weekend, it's a good result for him. Albeit, he is under investigation for an unsafe release at the time of recording. I do hope he gets to keep that result, as who knows how much higher up the order he could have finished without that issue. So it's 2 wins in a row for Ferrari, albeit with another power unit failure for the team. Leclerc is still 38 points behind Verstappen, but it feels like Ferrari could close that gap if they keep these performances up. But they also need to sort out race strategy, and if you want to learn more about that, watch this video next.